Jewish Meditation by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, a practical guide.
Chapter 12, Relating to God. As we discussed in the previous chapter, the first paragraph of the Amidah is the most important element of the service for use as a meditation. Moreover, this blessing defines the I-thou relationship between the worshipper and God. Let us explore this paragraph word by word. The first blessing of the Amidah is, Blessed are you, Adonai, our God and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, great, mighty, and awesome God, highest God, doer of good, kind deeds, master of all, who remembers the love of the patriarchs and brings a redeemer to their children's children for his name's sake, with love. King, helper, rescuer, and shield. Blessed are you, Adonai, shield of Abraham. The first word of the Amidah is blessed, Baruch in Hebrew. It is difficult to understand what the term blessed means when applied to God. A person can be blessed to have life, health, prosperity, children, and other benefits, but what does it mean when we say that God is blessed? If we look at blessings in the Bible, we always find that God is giving the recipient of the blessing some good or benefit. For example, Isaac says to Jacob, May God give you from the dew of heaven and from the fat of the earth, Genesis 27:28. The main point of this and other blessings in the Bible is that God will be granting the recipient a special providence and that he will have a special relationship and closeness to the one receiving the blessing. A blessing is therefore an expression of God's immanence. When we say that God is blessed, we are saying that his immanent presence is the source of all blessings. This implies that God is close, very close to us. Many Jewish sources indicate that the word blessed specifically denotes God's immanence in the world. When we recite the word blessed, Baruch, in the Amidah, we should be aware that God is very close, permeating the very air around us. We should feel God in our bones, in our flesh, in our minds, in the deepest recesses of our souls. We should also be aware that God makes himself available in order to enhance our closeness to him. The next word is you, atah, in Hebrew. This word refers to the I-thou relationship that we have with God. Simply saying you to God makes us aware that we are speaking directly to him. When we say this word, we should be aware of the divine directly in front of us and feel all the love, strength, and awe that exist when we confront the divine. Then comes God's name, which in Hebrew is pronounced Adonai. This name is actually written as the Tetragrammaton, YHVH. But since this most holy name may not be pronounced, the name Adonai, which means my Lord, is substituted. This substitution teaches us some very important lessons about the divine. The meaning of the Tetragrammaton on one level has been discussed in chapter 7. However, there is another way of understanding this name on an even deeper level. The codes note that the Tetragrammaton, YHVH, appears to be related to the past, present, and future of the Hebrew verb to be. In Hebrew, was is haya, is hoveh, and will be is yiyeh. Therefore, the codes state, when one sees the Tetragrammaton, one should have in mind that God was, is, and will be all at once. This indicates that God is utterly transcendental, higher even than the realm of time. God exists in a realm where time does not exist. This also implies that God is totally different from anything else in creation. We cannot even begin to imagine a being existing outside of space for whom the very concept of space does not apply. It is even more difficult to imagine a being who exists outside of time, so much so that past, present, and future are all the same to him. Our very thought processes are dependent on time and can function only within the framework of time, yet none of this applies to God. Of course, even to use the word being with relation to God is a misnomer and anthropomorphism. The only reason that we think of God as a being is so that we can speak to him, and being is the only category into which we can fit that to which we can speak. Of course, the fact that being is the closest category into which we can place God does not mean that he is a being. As we have discussed earlier, there is no category into which we can place God. There are two major supercategories in our mind into which all things can be placed, that of things and that of relationships or states. If we could place God in the category of things, then we would speak of him as a being. However, if we placed him in the category of relationships, we would speak of him as a principle. Thus, when we say that God is the creator of the universe, we are speaking of him as a being. On the other hand, when we say God is the creative force in the universe, we are speaking of him as a principle. The first time I used this concept in a class, one of my students asked a simple but very tricky question. If God exists outside of space, how can we say that God is everywhere? After a few moments of thought, the idea struck me. I asked the class, does the equation 1 plus 1 equal 2 exist in space? The class's response was that this equation obviously does not exist in space. The equation 1 plus 1 equals 2 is not a thing that can exist in space, but rather a mathematical relationship. It is a mathematical principle, and as such, it exists in the world of ideas and not in space. Then I asked another question: is there any place where 1 plus 1 equals 2 does not exist? The obvious answer was no. Wherever one would go in the entire universe and beyond, one would find that 1 plus 1 equals 2. This simple equation is a good example of something that does not exist in space and yet at the same time exists everywhere. This is true of every universal principle. By nature, an abstract principle is not spatial and therefore exists outside of space. Yet if we are speaking of a universal principle, such as any of the principles of mathematics, there is no place where it does not exist. For many purposes, it would be useful to think of God as a principle rather than a being. For one thing, it would make it readily understandable how he exists outside of space and time, and yet fills all space and time. For another, an idea such as this breaks down the anthropomorphic ideas that people have about God. One may be tempted to say God is a principle. However, as I discussed earlier, the sentence God is ... is a statement that cannot be completed. God is the creator of all categories and therefore cannot fit into any of them. Both principle and being are approximations that we use because the mind has no category into which it can place God. It may be that a third, intermediate category might be a better approximation, but the mind has no example of it, and therefore such a category cannot be imagined. Nevertheless, through meditation, one can gain a glimmer of the nature of this third category. The Tetragrammaton appears to relate to God as a principle rather than as a being. It denotes God's existence in the past, the present, and the future simultaneously, just like that of any other principle. Earlier, I discussed how the Tetragrammaton denotes the 4 steps in the process through which God gives existence to his creation. See Chapter 8. In this respect, we are also seeing the Tetragrammaton as describing God as the creative principle. Nevertheless, it is not easy to relate to a principle which appears totally impersonal and indeed is. In prayer and worship, it is much easier to relate to God as a being. Therefore, we do not pronounce the Tetragrammaton, but instead substitute Adonai, my Lord. This indicates that God is Lord and Master of all creation. In seeing God as Lord and Master, we are viewing him as a being rather than as a principle. Mastery and dominance are anthropomorphic concepts that are most fitting to a sentient being. As we reach the name of God that is written as the Tetragrammaton and pronounce Adonai, we become aware that we are addressing a being principle. We see God as the principle that gives existence to all things, yet at the same time we see God as a being, and furthermore as a being to whom we can relate. When we speak to God, it is as if we are communing with existence itself, but at the same time speaking to it as if it were a person. At the same time, we realize that God is more than existence, actually the principle that allows existence to be. When we pronounce God's name, Adonai, we are aware that we are addressing the infinite being, who is the absolute other. The very next word, however, is Eloheinu, which is translated as our God. This shows the extent to which God allows us to relate to him and draw close. As far above us as he is, he allows us to address him as our God, as if, in a sense, he belonged to us. This is perhaps the greatest gift and miracle of all, that God allows us to call him ours. The full expression in which we address God as ours is our God and God of our fathers, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu. The Baal Shem Tov explains this expression in the following manner. There are 2 ways in which we can know God. First, we know about God because we have heard about him from others. We have inherited a tradition about God from our fathers, from our ancestors, and from all the great people of the past. This, however, is not enough. No matter how much a person may have heard about God, he must also have his own personal experience of God. Unless a person has experienced God for himself, he will never have any true idea of what God is. In a way, it is like love. If you have ever been in love, then you know what I mean when I speak about love. But if you have never been in love, the word is totally abstract. You may imagine that love is something very nice, but you have no experience of it. Even if you read what poets sing about love, you can understand it only on the most abstract level. However, if you have ever been in love, the word will have very powerful connotations for you. The same is true of God. If you have experienced closeness to God even once in your life, then when I speak about God, you know exactly what I mean, and the concept has a very strong spiritual connotation. But if you have never had this experience, then God is something very abstract and can be described only on an intellectual level. We can speak about God, argue about him, and even debate his existence. However, if you have ever experienced God, then there is nothing to talk about. As soon as I mention the word God, you know exactly what I am speaking about, since God is as much part of your experience as he is of mine. One who has never been in love might argue that love does not exist. The same is true of someone who has never experienced God, but for one who has had the experience, there is no question. When one experiences God, however, there is always the danger that it is a false experience. That is, you may think that you are experiencing God, but you may actually be experiencing something very different. It is for this reason that we say, and God of our fathers. The experience of God is not something that we are inventing, something that has no relation to our past. Rather, it is part of a tradition that goes back to our earliest ancestors. We affirm that we are not going off in our quest for God on our own, but doing so as part of an unbroken chain of tradition. We then say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. We mention the patriarchs because we see them as having attained the ultimate experience of God. For them, the experience of God was so strong that they were willing to challenge their environment and change their lives because of it, becoming the spiritual trailblazers for millions that followed them. At this opening point in the Amidah, we attempt to direct our consciousness to the level of closeness to God that the patriarchs had experienced. It is taught that Abraham's primary experience of God was that of his greatness, whereas Isaac experienced God's strength and Jacob experienced his awesomeness. Thus, the peak experiences of the patriarchs correspond to the next three expressions in the Amidah: the great, mighty, and awesome God. When one says that God is great, Hagadol, in the Amidah, one should concentrate on greatness and immensity. Try to imagine how great God is. Think of the size of the largest thing you can imagine, then go further and try to imagine the size of the planet Earth. Continue and imagine the size of the sun, the solar system, the galaxy, and then the entire universe. Then realize how tiny this all is in comparison with the greatness of God. Compared with Him, the entire universe is less than a mote of dust. This, of course, is contemplation on an intellectual level, and during the Amidah is not the time for such intellectualizing. When we say the expression the great, we have to take the concept of greatness beyond the intellectual level. The mind expands with the concept of greatness and becomes aware of greatness and bigness in its purest and most abstract form. The concept of greatness reverberates through one's entire being, and one can then catch a glimpse of what it means in relation to God. In Kabbalah, God's greatness is closely associated with His love, chesed. When we imagine an infinite being ready to listen to the voice of an infinitesimal creature, we realize that there can be no greater love. Thus, in the greatness, there is also love. This is another reason that Abraham is associated with God's attribute of greatness and love. It is taught that Abraham directed his life to emulate God's love. Abraham was an important personage in his time, with sufficient status to rub shoulders with kings and monarchs. Nevertheless, he would literally run to greet and serve even the lowliest of wayfarers. See Genesis 18:3 and 4. The next word is the mighty, Hakibur. When one says this word, one should think of God's strength. Earlier I mentioned how one can look at one's own hand and see the strength in it. When one says the word the mighty, one should likewise concentrate on strength in its pure form. When one thinks about strength in terms of God, it expands until it overwhelms the mind. One then begins to have an inkling of strength as it applies to God. Finally, we say, and the awesome, the Hanorah. This emulates the experience of Jacob at Bethel, after he saw the vision of God and the ladder, when he said, how awesome is this place? Genesis 28:17. When one is aware of God's greatness and strength, one is overcome with a feeling of awe. Rather than being a frightening experience, it is a sweet and beautiful awe, the awe that comes from standing in the presence of the infinite. The next phrase is highest God, El Elyon. This expression is designated to make us realize that when we say that God is great, mighty, and awesome, these adjectives are not meant to limit Him in any way, but merely name the emotions and experiences that we have when we try to draw close to God. When one attempts to approach God, as we do in the Amidah, one first has a sensation of infinite greatness, then a feeling of infinite strength, and finally a feeling of overwhelming awe. It is important to realize that God is above all these. The mind must therefore soar above greatness, above strength, above awe, and realize that God transcends any thought that we could possibly have. God is beyond the sky, beyond the stars, beyond the heavens, and even beyond the spiritual realm. This last concept is important to reiterate. Often people speak of God as a spirit or as being spiritual. However, God is above the spiritual just as He is above the physical. Just as He is the creator of the concept of the physical, He is also the creator of the concept of the spiritual. As creator of the spiritual, He cannot be encompassed by it. Therefore, as high as our concept of God may be, it cannot even begin to come close to His true essence. The Amidah puts this very succinctly when it refers to Him as highest God. Immediately after saying that God is the ineffable, highest God, we say that He is the doer of good, kind deeds. Although God is higher than any thought can conceive, He still does things that we can perceive as being kind and good. Therefore, when we say these words, we are aware of God's infinite goodness and kindness. This is very closely related to a Talmudic teaching. Wherever you find mention of God's greatness, you also find mention of His humility. What the Talmud is saying is that an infinite being is not limited by any human conception of greatness or smallness. God is so great that to Him a galaxy is no more significant than a bacterium. At the same time, He is great enough that a single human being can be as significant to Him as an entire universe. After this, we speak of God as Koneh HaKol, which has been translated as Master of All, but which would be more literally translated as Owner of All. Just as an owner can do as he pleases with his property, so God can do as he wills with all things. All creation is God's property, and he can do with it as he wills. Moreover, an owner takes possession of his property and associates it with his person. In a certain sense, anything a person owns is an extension of the self. In a similar manner, God associates himself with his creation, and his essence permeates all existence. The Amidah then links the past to the future, saying that God remembers the love of the patriarchs and brings a redeemer to their children's children. God thus shares our memory of the past, especially with regard to the patriarchs, who were the first ones to bring God consciousness to the world. Just as we look to the patriarchs for a paradigm of the God experience, God looks at their love for Him as a paradigm and as a reason to remain close to their descendants no matter what happens. We also see God as our hope in the future, no small thing in this age over which hangs a Damocles sword of nuclear destruction. We believe that God will bring a Redeemer who will make the world a safe and sane place to live. We have faith that there will come a time when all humanity will be brought back to the God consciousness that the patriarchs enjoyed, and that this will be a time of universal peace and good for all humankind. This is our ultimate hope in the future. We conclude by saying that God remembers the patriarchs and will bring a Redeemer for his name's sake. As we discussed earlier, God's name is much more than an arbitrary collection of sounds. Rather, it is a word that speaks of his essence and his relationship with creation. The name is an important focus of our God consciousness, as I have discussed in previous chapters. God's name also figures both in the lives of the patriarchs and in our hope in the future. The experience of the patriarchs was always closely linked to God's name. The Torah tells that Abraham began his career by calling in the name of God. Genesis 12:8. The patriarchs were thus the ones who initiated God consciousness to the world through his name. Not only did they link themselves to the infinite, but they also identified it with a name. The process begun by the patriarchs will be completed by the promised Redeemer, who will bring God's name to all humanity. One of the important prophecies regarding the messianic future is that on that day God will be one, and his name one. Zechariah 14:9. Not only will the entire world worship God, but everyone will call him by the same name. This will indicate that the whole world will have the same God consciousness as the heirs of the patriarchs. The Amidah expresses this by stating that the entire process will be for his name's sake. The initial portion ends with the expression with love, be'ahava. It is love that bridges the gap between the past and future, even as love bridges the gap between man and woman. In a sense, the past and future can be looked upon as a male and a female. Just as the male impregnates the female, the past impregnates the future. The redemption in the future will come from the memory of the patriarchs in the past. It is God's love spanning the chasm of time. Moreover, God causes the processes of history to unfold, the goal being the perfection of humanity and society. This entire process is governed by love. We make ourselves aware of God's love at this point in the Amidah and are totally saturated by it. The first paragraph in the Amidah concludes with 4 words that are designated to bring God closer to the worshiper. These 4 words are King, Helper, Rescuer, and Shield. Whereas in the first part of this paragraph we relate to God in a general manner, here we develop our personal relationship with Him. These 4 words are the key to the entire Amidah. If one says them correctly, one is left in a perfect spiritual space for the rest of the service. Even if one has said the first parts of this paragraph without proper concentration, if these 4 words are said properly, they will bring the worshipper to such a closeness to God that the rest of the Amidah will be perfect. If one cannot say the entire first paragraph at the rate of 7 seconds per word, as mentioned earlier, one should at least do so for these 4 words. Let us look at these 4 words in detail. The first word is king, melech. We begin by looking at God as our king, and at our relationship to him as that of a subject to a king. A king is far away, in his capital city, in his palace. If you want something from the king, you must send him a formal request, and it goes through his staff, his ministers, his secretary. Then, if you are lucky, after a few months, you may get a reply. Therefore, when we address God as king, we see him as majestic but distant. Help is available from him, but not closely available. In the next word, we address God as helper, ozer. Now we see him as much closer than a king. A helper is someone whom we can readily approach. He is a friend whom we know we can always call on, and who always will make himself available. Therefore, when we call God helper, we realize that we can call on him at any time, and he will be there for us. This is a relationship much closer than that to a king. In saying this word, we are beginning the process through which we draw closer to God. Third, we address God as rescuer, Moshiach. Again, A rescuer is much closer than a helper. A rescuer is someone who is available to save you when you are drowning in a river. He is right there to jump in and pull you out. A helper may have the best intentions in the world, but if he is not close to you at all times, he cannot save you when you are in danger. Therefore, when we speak to God as our rescuer, we see him as being available whenever we need him, ready to rescue us in an instant. We recognize that God is always close enough to help us, even when we are in imminent danger. Thus, the relationship of rescuer is much closer than that of helper. This word brings us yet a step closer to God. Finally, we speak to God as our shield, Magen. A shield is even closer than a rescuer. A shield can help even when an arrow is flying at me and there is nothing else that can stop it. When the arrow is flying, there is no time for even the rescuer to intercept it. The shield must be there in place, right in front of me. Thus, when I address God as my shield, I feel him right in front of me. God is all around me, surrounding me like a suit of divine armor. I am totally aware of God's protective power surrounding me on all sides. I feel that I am being protected by God so that nothing in the world can harm me. Thus, in the four words king, helper, rescuer, and shield, we become more and more aware of God's closeness. First, we see him as a benevolent but distant king, then as a willing helper, then as a nearby rescuer, and finally, as an imminent shield. In these four words, we make the transition from viewing God as a remote transcendental force to seeing him as a protector who is closer than the air around us. The one person who reached the level where he could constantly see God as his shield was Abraham. God had told him, "Do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you." Genesis 15:1. From that time on, Abraham had a constant perception of God as his shield. He was always aware of God being very close to him, surrounding him and protecting him on a most imminent and direct level. It is for this reason that the first paragraph ends with the blessing, "Blessed are you, Adonai, shield of Abraham." It makes us aware that such a level of God consciousness exists and that it can even be woven into a way of life, as in the case of Abraham. Of all the levels of relationship to God, the level of shield is the closest. Here we see God close enough to us to stop even a flying bullet. This was the level attained by Abraham, and at this point in the Amidah, we aspire to it. The word blessed, Baruch, occurs twice in this first paragraph. The paragraph begins with the word blessed, and then it is repeated in the ending, "Blessed are you, Adonai, shield of Abraham." It is significant that it was ordained that we bow at each of these points. As discussed earlier, the word blessed indicates God's immanence and his power of blessing, which permeates all creation. We bow when we say blessed to indicate that we are aware of this immanence. We feel that God is directly in front of us, and we are bowing to this presence. By the time we reach the end of the paragraph, we have raised our consciousness of God's immanence considerably. At the beginning of the blessing, we were aware of God's immanence, but only in an abstract sense. At the end, our consciousness of God's immanence is such that it is as tangible and palpable as a shield. To indicate our new awareness, we bow a second time. There are two other places at which we also bow in the Amidah. These are at the beginning and end of the blessing of thanksgiving, Modim, which is the second from the last section of the Amidah. To understand the reason for this, we must first understand the structure of the Amidah as a whole. It is taught that the essential structure of any prayer should contain three elements: adoration, petition, and thanksgiving. In that order. This structure is maintained in the Amidah. The first three paragraphs consist of adoration, wherein we establish a degree of God consciousness in the mind. The first paragraph is the key to this process, as we have seen. The second general part of the Amidah is that of petition, wherein we ask God for certain things. This part consists of the next 14 blessings of the Amidah. It is significant to note that in Hebrew, the number 14 is written out as Yud Dalith, which also spells Yad, the Hebrew word for hand. As it were, we are asking that our petitions be answered through God's hand. What we are doing essentially in the petition stage is using the spiritual energy developed in the first three blessings to bring about the things we want, both as individuals and as a nation. First, we ask for our own personal needs, petitioning God for wisdom, closeness, atonement, healing, and blessings. Then we ask for the things that will affect the Israelite people as a whole. The latter part of the petition stage thus deals primarily with redemption. According to this pattern, the Amidah should end with thanksgiving. In thanking God, we show awareness of the closeness and spiritual energy that He allows us to experience, and thus integrate it into our being. We would therefore expect the Amidah to end with the blessing of thanksgiving, or Modim, as it is called. Actually, however, this blessing is the second from the last. There is an important reason for this, and that is so that the Amidah can end with a petition and blessing for peace. Once one has drawn down spiritual energy, one can find internal peace. This internal peace can be projected to enhance national and universal peace as well. When a person can fully thank God in a mystical as well as a mundane sense, he is at perfect peace. In thanking God, we also draw in the energy that is developed in the service. The bowing acknowledges the power of God that we have drawn into our essence. Since this is the purpose of the blessing of thanksgiving, we bow once at its beginning and again at its end. Bowing in the Amidah also has another important connotation. The Talmud states that one of the reasons why the Amidah has 18 blessings is that they parallel the 18 vertebrae of the spine and neck. The 19th blessing, which was added later, parallels the coccyx, the small bone at the base of the spine. This brings to mind the concept of Kundalini energy that is discussed in Eastern teachings. This is not to suggest that there is any relationship between the Jewish teaching and that of the East, but merely to point out that the spine is universally recognized as an important conduit of energy. Moreover, whereas in Kundalini meditation one strives to elevate energy from the base of the spine to the head, in the Amidah one brings energy from the mind to the rest of the body. The Talmud also teaches that if one does not bow in the blessing of thanksgiving, one's spine turns into a snake. Obviously, this is to be taken not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual meaning. One reason the Talmud gives us for the number of blessings corresponding to the number of vertebrae is that one must bow low enough for each vertebrae to be separated from the one next to it. The Talmud also teaches that when one bows, one should do so like a rod, but when one rises, one should do so like a serpent, raising the head first and then the body. The Kundalini energy is also seen as taking the form of a serpent. In Jewish tradition, however, the serpent is seen as the enemy of mankind. The serpent is the tempter who tries to use sexual energy to draw humans away from God. The Talmud therefore teaches that if one does not bow during the Amidah, then one's spine turns into a snake. In contrast, the posture in Kundalini meditation requires that the spine be kept perfectly straight and erect. If a person worships in this manner without bowing, then his spine will become infused with the Kundalini energy, which is the serpent. Bowing may be a way of overcoming this energy of the serpent. The concept of Kundalini is to bring energy up from the sexual area to the rest of the body. Bowing has the opposite connotation, namely that of bringing energy down from the head to the body. Therefore, when we bow, we lower the head toward the body. Only after we have bowed and infused the body with spiritual energy can we rise and lift energy from the spine to the head, rising like a snake. In this manner, the Amidah is designed to bring spiritual energy through the spine to the entire body. This is also a reason why this prayer is said with the feet together. As I have said, this is the stance in which angels are visualized. During the Amidah, one strives to bring oneself into an angelic mode, wherein the spiritual becomes dominant over the physical.